Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Becky Sullivan had been standing in courtroom 3B of the federal building in Denver, Colorado, for exactly 45 minutes. She stood in full dress uniform, her chest decorated with 12 commendations earned over 26 years of military service. Each medal represented something: a moment of bravery, a moment of sacrifice, a moment when she had done her job and done it well. Judge Harold Pemberton sat behind his elevated bench, looking down at her like she was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe. The case in front of him had nothing to do with Becky's medals. It was a property dispute. She and her ex-husband, David, were fighting over the family home. They'd been divorced for 3 years, and they couldn't agree on how to divide the assets. So here they were, in front of a judge, fighting over a house neither of them even lived in anymore. Becky had no reason to be in uniform. Her lawyer, Margaret Chen, had actually advised against it. "Just wear civilian clothes," Margaret had suggested. "This is a civil matter. You don't need to be in uniform." But Becky had worn the uniform anyway, because she needed to feel like herself, because standing in front of a judge about money and property felt diminishing, and the uniform reminded her of who she was beyond this divorce. She was a soldier. She was an officer. She was someone who had earned respect. Or so she thought. Judge Pemberton looked at her uniform, and something flickered across his face, something that looked like contempt. "Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "I see you've dressed up for court, very impressive with all the decorations. Tell me, did you wear all of that to intimidate me? To make me think I should rule in your favor because you're some kind of war hero?" The courtroom went silent. Margaret put her hand on Becky's arm, a silent warning to stay calm. "No, Your Honor," Becky said carefully. "I wore my uniform because you wanted to make a statement," Judge Pemberton interrupted. "Well, let me tell you something about those medals, Lieutenant Colonel. I've seen a lot of people come through my courtroom in fancy uniforms with fancy decorations. And you know what I've learned? Most of it is just theater. It's just a way for people to convince everyone that they're more important than they are." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench. "In my courtroom, your medals don't matter. Your rank doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the truth. And the truth, as I see it, is that you and your ex-husband are two people fighting over money. And I'm going to decide how that money gets divided based on the law, not based on how many decorations you've managed to pin on your chest." Becky felt her face flush. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. There were a few people there, her ex-husband and his lawyer, a court reporter, a few observers who had wandered in out of curiosity. She stood silently, absorbing the disrespect. Judge Pemberton continued, "In fact, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not impressed. I've met a lot of military officers over the years. Some of them were decent people. But a lot of them were just like everyone else, selfish, willing to bend the rules, willing to do whatever it takes to get what they want. Those medals don't prove you're a good person. They prove you're willing to follow orders." Margaret stood up. "Your Honor, I don't think my client's choice of attire is relevant to these proceedings." "Sit down, Ms. Chen," Judge Pemberton said coldly, "unless you want me to find you in contempt of court." Margaret sat down. Becky stood there, feeling the weight of the moment, feeling the public humiliation of having her medals, her service, her sacrifice dismissed as theater. The judge spent the next 2 hours going through the property division. He treated Becky's arguments with barely concealed disdain. He repeatedly questioned her credibility. When she tried to explain something about the household finances, he interrupted her and said, "I'm sure you're very good at following military orders, but in this courtroom we deal with facts, not military propaganda." By the time it was over, Becky had been awarded 40% of the house's value instead of the 50% her lawyer had argued for. It was a loss. Not a devastating loss, but a loss nonetheless. And it was a loss that felt like more than just money. After the hearing ended, Becky sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Margaret. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "I warned you about his reputation. Judge Pemberton has a bias against military personnel. He served in the Peace Corps in the 1970s, and he's held a grudge against the military ever since." "He called my medals theater," Becky said quietly. "I know it was inappropriate. We can file a complaint. We can ask for an appeal based on judicial bias." "Will it help?" Maybe not, but I think we have grounds." Becky drove home to her small apartment in Boulder, just outside Denver. She lived alone since the divorce. She'd bought this place because it felt peaceful, quiet, a place where she could process the end of her marriage and figure out who she was apart from David. She changed out of her uniform carefully, hanging each piece in the closet. She looked at her medals lying on the dresser. The Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, multiple times, the National Defense Service Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal. Each one represented a moment. She could point to every single medal and tell you the story behind it. She could tell you why she earned it. She could tell you who she was serving alongside when it happened. They weren't theater. They were proof that her life had meant something. She thought about Judge Pemberton's words. Those medals don't prove you're a good person. They prove you're willing to follow orders. Is that what it looked like to people on the outside? Just following orders? Did no one understand that you didn't stay in the military for 26 years just because you were following orders? You stayed because you believed in something. You stayed because you were committed to the people you served with. You stayed because it meant something. Her phone rang. It was her best friend, Colonel Michael "Mike" Patterson. They'd served together for most of their military careers. Mike was currently stationed at Fort Carson, just south of Denver. "How did the hearing go?" Mike asked. "It went badly," Becky said. She told him about Judge Pemberton's comments, about the dismissal of her service, about the financial loss. There was silence on the other end of the line. "He said that about your medals?" Mike asked finally, his voice tight. "He said they were theater. He said they didn't prove anything except that I follow orders." "That's not just disrespectful," Mike said. "That's judicial bias. That's an abuse of his authority. Margaret is talking about filing a complaint, but I don't know if it will matter." "It matters," Mike said. "Becky, what he did matters. You served your country with honor. Those medals represent real sacrifice. And he dismissed it in his courtroom. That's not okay." After they hung up, Becky sat in the darkness of her apartment. She wasn't angry. She was something worse than angry. She was discouraged. She was beginning to doubt whether the sacrifice she'd made for the last 26 years had meant anything at all. She thought about all the deployments, all the time away from her family, all the missions, all the moments when she'd put her life on the line, all the friends she'd lost. And for what? To be dismissed by a judge as someone just following orders. She lay down on her couch and pulled a blanket over herself. She didn't sleep. She just lay there thinking, trying to understand what she was supposed to do with the feeling that everything she'd worked for had just been diminished. She didn't know it yet, but someone had heard about what happened in that courtroom. Someone with the authority to do something about it. Someone who was going to make sure that Judge Pemberton's disrespect of military service didn't go unanswered. And that someone was about to change everything. 3 days after the hearing, Becky was at her job. She worked as a civilian consultant for the Department of Defense, helping with training programs and leadership development. It was fulfilling work, but it was also work that was far removed from the humiliation she'd experienced in Judge Pemberton's courtroom. She was in a meeting when her secretary, Tom, stuck his head in the door. "Becky," he said, looking slightly panicked, "you have a phone call from General Patricia Richardson. She says it's urgent." The room went quiet. General Patricia Richardson was a 3-star general in the Army. She was one of the most powerful military leaders in the country. She was also someone Becky had never met. Becky excused herself from the meeting and took the call in her office. "Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan?" General Richardson's voice was clear and direct. "This is General Patricia Richardson. I'm calling about what happened in Judge Pemberton's courtroom." Becky's heart rate increased. "Yes, General, how did you?" "A colleague of yours reached out to my office," General Richardson said. "Colonel Patterson, he felt that what happened to you was unjust, and he was right. I've reviewed the court transcript. I want to tell you something, Lieutenant Colonel. What happened in that courtroom was more than disrespectful. It was judicial bias. It was an abuse of authority, and it's not the first time Judge Pemberton has done this." "I don't understand, General. What can be done about it?" "There's quite a bit that can be done," General Richardson said. "First, I want to tell you that I've had a preliminary investigation done into Judge Pemberton's judicial record. What I found is disturbing. He has a pattern of treating military personnel unfairly. In the last 5 years, he's presided over 23 cases involving military personnel. And in 20 of those cases, he's ruled against the military person. That's not justice, Lieutenant Colonel. That's bias." Becky sat down, trying to process what she was hearing. Second, General Richardson continued, I want to apologize to you on behalf of the military. You served your country with honor. Those medals represent real sacrifice, and you deserve to have that respect honored in that courtroom. Thank you, General, Becky said quietly. I'm calling for another reason too, General Richardson said. I want to know if you're willing to let me take action. What Judge Pemberton did was wrong. It was illegal, and I think it's time someone held him accountable, but I need your permission to do that. What kind of action? Becky asked. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission. I'm going to present evidence of his pattern of bias. I'm going to request that his case against you be reviewed and potentially overturned. And I'm going to make sure that this becomes public knowledge. This kind of disrespect for military service can't be allowed to continue. Not in the federal judiciary. Not anywhere. Becky felt something shift inside her. Not relief exactly, but something like vindication. Someone in power understood that what had happened was wrong. Someone was willing to fight for her. Yes, General, Becky said. I'm willing to let you take action. Good, General Richardson said. I'm going to need you to do a few things. First, I need you to provide a detailed statement about what happened in the courtroom. Everything he said, everything he did, every way he showed bias. Can you do that? Yes, General. Second, I need you to authorize me to reach out to other military personnel who have appeared before Judge Pemberton. I want to see if there's a pattern. I want to see if other people have experienced similar treatment. Of course. Third, General Richardson said, I'm going to hold a press conference. I'm going to make this public. I'm going to make sure that everyone understands what happened, and I'm going to make sure that the public understands that the military will not tolerate disrespect from the judicial system. Is that okay with you? Becky hesitated. Going public meant that everyone would know about her divorce. Everyone would know about the property dispute. It would be embarrassing in some ways, but it would also mean that what happened wouldn't be swept under the rug. Yes, General, she said. I'm okay with that. Thank you, General Richardson said. I'll be in touch about the details. And Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, thank you for your service. Thank you for earning those medals the right way. We're going to make sure that means something. After they hung up, Becky sat in her office for a long time, just thinking about the conversation. For the first time since the hearing, she felt something like hope. Over the next 2 weeks, General Richardson's team reached out to other military personnel who had appeared before Judge Pemberton. They found 7 people willing to talk about their experiences. Each story was similar to Becky's. Each person had felt dismissed and disrespected. Each person had lost their case in ways that seemed motivated by bias rather than law. One of them was Captain Anthony Torres, a Marine who had gone before Judge Pemberton in a custody battle. The judge had suggested that Torres' military service meant he was likely to be an absent father. He'd ruled in favor of Torres' ex-wife even though the evidence supported Torres having custody. Torres had lost his kids, and according to him, Judge Pemberton's bias had played a major role. Another was Sergeant Lisa Caldwell, an Air Force veteran who had gone before Judge Pemberton in a contract dispute. The judge had suggested that military people were trained to lie, and he'd ruled against her on that basis, even though there was no evidence of lying. General Richardson compiled all of this into a comprehensive report. She documented the pattern. She showed the statistical evidence. She demonstrated that Judge Pemberton treated military personnel differently than civilians. And then she held a press conference. It was held at the Pentagon, and it was packed with media. General Richardson stood at the podium in her full dress uniform, looking every inch the powerful military leader she was. I'm here today because something happened in a federal courtroom in Denver that I believe the American people need to know about, General Richardson began. She went through the details. She talked about Judge Pemberton's pattern of bias. She talked about the cases she'd investigated. She talked about how military personnel had been systematically treated unfairly in his courtroom. Now I want to be clear, General Richardson said. I respect the federal judiciary. I believe in the justice system. But I also believe that when someone abuses their position of authority, that needs to be exposed. Judge Harold Pemberton has abused his authority. He has shown bias against military personnel, and he has caused real harm to real people. She paused, letting the cameras capture the weight of her words. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Sullivan is one of those people, General Richardson continued. She is a decorated officer who has served her country with honor for 26 years. She appeared in Judge Pemberton's courtroom in a straightforward property dispute. And instead of giving her the fair hearing she deserved, Judge Pemberton attacked her for wearing her uniform. He dismissed her medals as theater. He suggested that her service didn't prove anything except that she followed orders. That is disrespect, that is bias, and I will not tolerate it. The media exploded with questions. General Richardson answered some of them, laying out the facts, presenting the evidence, making it clear that this wasn't a matter of opinion. This was a pattern of judicial misconduct. The next day, the story was everywhere. Major news outlets covered it. Legal analysts discussed the implications. Journalists reached out to Judge Pemberton for comment, but he refused to speak to the press. Becky watched the press conference from her apartment, and she cried. Not from sadness, but from a release of all the tension and frustration that had been building inside her since the hearing. General Richardson had done what Becky had begun to think was impossible. She had validated her. She had made it clear that Judge Pemberton was wrong. She had taken her side, not because of politics or because she liked her, but because it was the right thing to do. Mike called her after the press conference. "Did you see it?" he asked. "Yes," Becky said, "I saw it." "That was amazing. General Richardson really went to bat for you." "She did," Becky agreed. "And now everyone is going to know about my divorce." "They're going to know about your service too," Mike said. "They're going to know that you're a decorated officer who was treated unfairly. That's what people are going to remember." Becky wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that the public narrative would focus on justice rather than on the divorce. But she'd been around long enough to know that the truth was often more complicated than that. What she didn't expect was what came next. Within a week of General Richardson's press conference, the Judicial Conduct Commission announced that it was opening a formal investigation into Judge Pemberton's conduct. Within 2 weeks, they had preliminary findings that supported the bias pattern. But that wasn't the biggest thing that happened. A journalist named Rebecca Kimura, who worked for a major investigative news organization, did a deep dive into Judge Pemberton's background. What she found was shocking. Judge Pemberton had not just served in the Peace Corps. He had also applied to be a military officer and had been rejected because he didn't meet the physical requirements. He'd held a grudge about that for 50 years. Rebecca Kimura published a long-form article that detailed Pemberton's history, his rejection from military service, and how he'd apparently used his position as a judge to take out that old wound on anyone in uniform who appeared in his courtroom. The article went viral. It was shared millions of times. It became the subject of endless discussion online and on news programs. And then something unexpected happened. Victims of Judge Pemberton's bias started coming forward. Not just the 7 people General Richardson had found, but dozens of others. People from across the country who had been treated unfairly by Judge Pemberton and had never had anyone to advocate for them. There was a woman who had been a Marine reservist. She'd gone before Judge Pemberton in a bankruptcy case. He'd suggested that military people couldn't manage money responsibly, and he'd made her bankruptcy more difficult to discharge. She'd been struggling with the financial impact for 5 years. There was a man who had been a retired Army sergeant. He'd gone before Judge Pemberton in an employment dispute. The judge had ruled against him and suggested that military people didn't understand how to work in the civilian world. The sergeant had spent his own money fighting an appeal and eventually won, but only after years of struggle. There was a woman who had been a Navy pilot. She'd gone before Judge Pemberton seeking an injunction against harassment from a neighbor. Judge Pemberton had dismissed her case and suggested that military training made her overly aggressive in civilian disputes. The neighbor had continued harassing her until she eventually moved. With each new story, the pressure on Judge Pemberton increased. News organizations began calling for his removal. Legal organizations released statements saying that his behavior was unacceptable. Politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, called for investigation and potential removal from the bench. Judge Pemberton tried to defend himself. He gave an interview to a sympathetic conservative news outlet where he claimed that he was just being careful not to give special treatment to military personnel. He said that he treated everyone the same. He denied having any bias. But the evidence was too clear. The pattern was too obvious. 2 months after General Richardson's press conference, Judge Pemberton announced his resignation from the bench, effective immediately. He didn't issue a public apology. He didn't acknowledge wrongdoing, but the resignation itself was an admission. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon. Becky heard about it from Mike, who called her right after the news broke. "He resigned," Mike said. "He's gone." Becky felt relief, but she also felt something more complicated. She'd wanted justice, but now that it had happened, it felt strange. Like she'd been holding her anger close to her chest for so long that, without it, she didn't quite know how to stand. "Becky," Mike was still on the phone, "are you okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay, I'm just processing." "General Richardson is holding another press conference at 4 o'clock. She wants you to be there." Becky drove to the military base, where General Richardson had arranged for a press area to be set up. When she arrived, she was surprised to find that the general wanted her to speak. "I know this is unexpected," General Richardson said, meeting her outside the press area. "But I think it's important for people to hear directly from you, not from me, from you, about what happened, about what it meant, and about what you hope comes next." Becky's heart rate increased. She'd never spoken to the media before. The idea of standing in front of cameras and reporters terrified her. "General, I don't think I'm good at public speaking." "Yes, you are," General Richardson said firmly. "You're a military officer. You've led people under pressure. You've made decisions that affected people's lives. This is not that different. Just tell the truth. That's all anyone needs from you." When the press conference began, Becky stood at the podium in her dress uniform. She looked out at the cameras and the reporters and the notebook and the phones held up to record everything she said. And she started talking. "My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. I've served for 26 years. I've deployed to multiple countries. I've lost friends. I've made sacrifices. And I've earned the medals I wear on my chest." She paused, letting that sink in. 3 months ago, I appeared in the courtroom of Judge Harold Pemberton in Denver, Colorado. I wasn't there because of my military service. I was there because of a property dispute with my ex-husband. But when I walked into that courtroom in my uniform, Judge Pemberton decided that my medals meant something different than what they actually mean. He decided they were theater. He decided they were just proof that I follow orders. He decided that my 26 years of service was somehow relevant to a property dispute. Becky's voice grew stronger. What Judge Pemberton didn't understand, or what he didn't care about, was that those medals represent real moments. They represent times when I chose duty over comfort. They represent times when I sacrificed for people I didn't even know. They represent times when I risked my life and my well-being for something bigger than myself. She looked directly into the cameras. "I am grateful to General Richardson for taking this seriously. I am grateful to everyone who supported me. But I'm also angry. I'm angry that it took a general officer saying something for people to care about judicial bias. I'm angry that it took public pressure for something to happen. I'm angry that there are probably people right now sitting in courtrooms across this country being treated the way I was treated, and nobody is standing up for them." Becky paused, and her voice became quieter but also more intense. "Judge Pemberton resigned? That's good. That's what should have happened. But this is not over. We need to make sure that judges understand that disrespecting military service is not acceptable. We need to make sure that the federal judiciary understands that wearing a uniform doesn't make someone less credible. It doesn't make them theater. It makes them someone who has made a sacrifice, and that sacrifice deserves respect." After the press conference, Becky was approached by lawyers and journalists and supporters. Everyone wanted a piece of her story. Everyone wanted to know more. But what mattered most was when General Richardson pulled her aside afterward. "That was perfect," the general said. "You told the truth, that's all that matters." "Thank you for believing in me," Becky said. "Thank you for fighting for me." "That's what we do," General Richardson said. "We fight for each other. That's the foundation of everything we do in the military. And when that principle gets violated, when someone disrespects that, we have to stand up and say something." What started as an investigation into Judge Pemberton's conduct became something much larger. The Judicial Conduct Commission, under pressure from General Richardson and the public attention, opened a comprehensive review of Pemberton's entire judicial record. What they found was devastating. In his 28 years on the bench, Judge Pemberton had been involved in hundreds of cases. The commission reviewed cases going back 15 years and found a clear pattern. In cases involving military personnel or military families, Judge Pemberton had consistently ruled in ways that disadvantaged the military person. He'd done it through small biases, through harsh language, through rulings that had no legal basis but that aligned with his clear prejudice. The commission also discovered that multiple complaints had been filed against Judge Pemberton over the years. Complaints about bias, complaints about inappropriate comments, complaints about judicial misconduct. All of them had been dismissed or buried. Why? The investigation revealed that Judge Pemberton had allies in the system, other judges who protected him, court administrators who dismissed complaints without investigation, people who understood his bias but decided it wasn't their problem. Becky participated in the commission's investigation. She was interviewed extensively. She testified about her experience. She provided evidence of what happened in her case. And as she did, she learned something that made her angry all over again. The system had failed her, not just because of Judge Pemberton, but because the system itself had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. A retired federal judge named Sarah Mitchell reached out to Becky. Judge Mitchell had presided over cases for 30 years and had just read about the investigation into Pemberton. She wanted to talk to Becky about what she'd learned. "I've been thinking about my own record," Judge Mitchell said when they met. "I've been thinking about whether I missed things, whether I was complicit in allowing someone like Pemberton to operate this way." "How could you have prevented it?" Becky asked. "By speaking up," Judge Mitchell said. "By saying something when I saw his bias, by filing complaints when I heard about his conduct, by not protecting the institution at the expense of justice." Becky understood what Judge Mitchell was saying. The system had failed her because people who could have stopped it had chosen not to. They'd chosen to protect the institution. They'd chosen to protect Pemberton. They'd chosen to stay silent. 4 months after Judge Pemberton's resignation, the Judicial Conduct Commission released its final report. It was a comprehensive document detailing decades of judicial misconduct. It recommended that a federal investigation be opened into how Pemberton had been allowed to operate for so long. It recommended that the procedures for reviewing judicial conduct complaints be reformed. And it recommended that military personnel be specifically informed of their rights to challenge judicial bias. But the most significant part of the report was a specific recommendation. All of Judge Pemberton's cases that involved military personnel should be reviewed. Cases that were decided, cases that had been closed, cases that had been appealed and upheld. All of them should be reviewed to determine whether the outcomes had been affected by his bias. That recommendation meant that dozens of people who had lost cases before Judge Pemberton might have the opportunity to appeal, to reopen their cases, to get the fair hearing they should have gotten the first time. One of those people was Captain Anthony Torres, the Marine who had lost custody of his children. Torres had given up the legal fight years ago. He'd accepted that he would have limited contact with his kids. He'd accepted that he couldn't afford to keep fighting. But now, with the possibility of reopening his case, he reached out to lawyers who worked for free. 2 months later, Captain Torres' custody case was reopened. With new legal representation and with evidence that Judge Pemberton had shown clear bias against military personnel, the court reversed the original decision. Torres was awarded primary custody of his children. Becky watched this unfold from a distance, and she felt something like satisfaction. This was justice, not just for her but for everyone who had been wronged. But there was still something missing. Judge Pemberton had resigned, but he hadn't been held accountable in any real way. He wasn't going to jail. He wasn't going to face criminal charges. He was just going to go home and live his life, having resigned from the bench but not having paid any real price for decades of misconduct. That bothered Becky. She brought it up when she met with General Richardson to discuss what would happen next. "He got away with it," Becky said. "He resigned, so now he just disappears. No one will even know what he did." "That's not entirely true," General Richardson said. "His record is public now. Everyone knows what he did. He's been disgraced. His reputation is destroyed. He'll never hold a position of authority again." "But he won't go to jail," Becky said. "He won't face any real consequences." "No," General Richardson agreed. "He won't, and I understand why that's frustrating. But sometimes justice looks different than we think it will. Sometimes justice is exposure rather than punishment. Sometimes justice is knowing that you stood up and told the truth, and because you did, the system got better." Becky listened to what General Richardson was saying, and she knew the general was right. But it didn't completely satisfy her need for accountability. What happened next surprised everyone. 6 months after Judge Pemberton's resignation, the FBI opened a federal investigation into his conduct. Not for criminal charges related to his judicial decisions, but for civil rights violations. The question was whether Pemberton had violated the civil rights of the military personnel who appeared before him by denying them fair trials based on their status as military members. It was a novel legal theory, but it had merit, and the FBI took it seriously. For 8 months, the FBI investigated. They interviewed everyone who had appeared before Pemberton. They reviewed case files. They examined his communications. And at the end of it, they referred the case to the Department of Justice for potential prosecution. The Department of Justice took on the case. They filed suit against Judge Pemberton, seeking damages for the military personnel who had been harmed by his judicial bias. Judge Pemberton fought back. He hired expensive lawyers. He tried to have the case dismissed. But the evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. The court ruled that Pemberton had indeed violated the civil rights of military personnel and ordered him to pay significant damages to multiple victims. Judge Pemberton appealed and appealed again, but each time the decision was upheld. He had violated people's civil rights, he would have to pay. It took 3 years, but the final ruling came down, and Judge Pemberton was ordered to pay damages totaling more than $2 million to the 12 military personnel who had filed civil suits against him. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough to undo years of injustice, but it was something. It was accountability. It was the system finally working the way it was supposed to. Throughout all of this, Becky had remained visible. She hadn't faded away after her initial statement. She'd continued to speak about the importance of judicial fairness. She'd worked with legal organizations to develop better procedures for challenging judicial bias. She'd become an advocate. And she'd also continued her military career. She was promoted to colonel. She was given leadership positions. She was recognized not just as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had fought for justice and won. 5 years after the hearing in Judge Pemberton's courtroom, Becky stood in front of a crowd at a military legal conference. She was invited to speak about judicial bias and what could be done to prevent it. "I'm going to tell you something that I didn't understand at the time," Becky began. "When Judge Pemberton disrespected my medals in that courtroom, I thought it was about me. I thought it was about whether he liked me or respected me or thought I was a good person. But it wasn't about me. It was about something much bigger. It was about whether institutions were going to be held accountable when they failed. It was about whether the system was going to work the way it was supposed to." She paused, looking out at the crowd of military lawyers and judges and officers. The system didn't work at first. Judge Pemberton was allowed to operate unchecked for years because the system had failed. But then something changed. Then people started to care. Then people started to speak up. And then the system actually worked. She continued, "But here's what I want to say to everyone in this room. The system only works if we make it work. The system only holds people accountable if we demand accountability. The system only protects people if we're willing to fight for that protection. General Richardson didn't have to fight for me. She could have ignored it. She could have decided it wasn't her problem. But she didn't. And because she didn't, the system got better for everyone who came after me." After the conference, Becky met with General Richardson, who was also speaking at the event. They sat down for coffee, 2 women in uniform, reflecting on what had happened. "Do you ever regret it?" General Richardson asked. "Going public, making this so visible?" "No," Becky said without hesitation. "I regret that it happened. I regret that Judge Pemberton treated me and so many others the way he did. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret making it public. Because if I hadn't done that, someone else would still be sitting in his courtroom right now, being disrespected, being treated unfairly." "That's the right attitude," General Richardson said. "That's what it means to be a leader. It's not about what happens to you. It's about what you do about it and what that means for everyone who comes after you." 5 years became 10 years. Judges around the country became aware of the case. Legal associations developed new procedures for evaluating judges for bias. Training programs were created. The system actually changed, not completely, but measurably. Military personnel going before federal judges now had protections that didn't exist before. And the story of Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Sullivan and Judge Harold Pemberton became something of a legend in military and legal circles. A story about what happened when someone refused to accept injustice quietly. A story about what happened when leaders in power decided to stand up for what was right. A story about how systems can change if people are willing to fight for that change. Becky retired from the military after 30 years of service. She didn't retire quietly. Instead, she became a consultant on judicial reform and military law. She wrote a book about her experience called Standing Ground: My Fight for Respect in the Federal Courts. The book became a bestseller and was required reading in many law schools. In the acknowledgments of her book, Becky wrote, "To General Patricia Richardson, who taught me that standing up for what's right is not just about individual justice. It's about changing systems so that justice becomes the expectation rather than the exception. To every military person who has been treated unfairly by someone in power, your experience matters, your voice matters, and you deserve to be heard." The book's proceeds went to a foundation that Becky created called the Military Justice Alliance. The foundation provided legal support to military personnel who faced discrimination in the civilian justice system. They handled dozens of cases a year, fighting against bias, fighting for fairness, fighting for the kind of respect that should have always existed. On the day that Becky's foundation handled its 1,000th case, she stood in her office and looked at her medals on the wall. They were still there, just as they had been throughout the journey. The Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Commendation Medals, all of them. But now they meant something different. They weren't just proof of her service. They were proof that the system could change. They were proof that standing up mattered. They were proof that one person's willingness to fight could change things for thousands of people. Her assistant, a young veteran named James, came into the office. "Congratulations on the milestone," James said. 1,000 cases, that's incredible." "It is," Becky agreed. "But what's more incredible is thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up, if I'd just accepted Judge Pemberton's disrespect quietly. How many people wouldn't have gotten help?" "Thousands," James said. "Exactly," Becky said. "That's what this is really about. It's about understanding that when we're treated unfairly, when we're disrespected, when we're wronged, it's not just about us. It's about everyone who might experience the same thing if we don't stand up." Becky looked out the window of her office at the city below. Somewhere out there were military personnel facing injustice. There were people wearing uniforms, people who had sacrificed for their country, people who deserved respect and weren't getting it. And now they had a place to go. They had an organization that would fight for them. They had proof that standing up mattered. That evening, Becky received a letter. It was from a young woman named Sarah who had been a junior officer under Becky's command years ago. Sarah had recently gone through a legal battle in civilian court. The judge had been biased against her military service. Sarah had been prepared to accept an unfair outcome, but then she'd read about Becky's fight. She'd reached out to the Military Justice Alliance. She'd gotten a fair outcome. "Thank you for not giving up," Sarah wrote. "Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing me that I didn't have to accept unfairness quietly. You changed my life." Becky read the letter, and she cried. Not because she was sad, but because of the weight of knowing that one person's decision to stand up could ripple outward and touch so many lives. She thought about Judge Pemberton, sitting somewhere, living his life, probably not thinking much about what he'd done. She thought about how unfair that was, but she also realized that his lack of consequences didn't matter, because his attempt to diminish her had instead given her a mission. His disrespect had galvanized her into action. His injustice had become the foundation for a movement that was making the system better for everyone. That was the real victory. That was the real legacy. Not revenge, not punishment, but transformation. Becky pulled out her medals and held them in her hands. Each one was a reminder of the moments when she had chosen to serve, a reminder of the sacrifices she had made, a reminder of the people she had worked alongside, and most importantly, a reminder that those moments and those sacrifices meant something. Not because a judge said so, not because the system validated it, but because she knew in her heart that they mattered. And now, because of her willingness to stand up and fight, thousands of other military personnel would know that their service mattered too, that their respect was important, that they didn't have to accept disrespect quietly. That was what Judge Pemberton hadn't understood when he sat on that bench and dismissed her medals as theater. He hadn't understood that those medals weren't symbols of her ego. They were symbols of her commitment, and when that commitment was disrespected, it didn't diminish her. It motivated her. It galvanized her. It transformed her from someone seeking personal justice into someone fighting for systemic change. And systemic change, it turned out, was worth so much more than any individual victory could ever be.